What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in. This tutorial covers a small project I made inside of GitHub, which is a basic boilerplate of how to use Node.js and Express, but with TypeScript actually mixed into it. I get a lot of questions on how to actually create one of these, so I thought I'd make a boilerplate available to you guys inside of GitHub and make a little video to explain how I did it. If you don't want to watch the video, by all means, just go to GitHub, fork the repository, and have fun. But if you want to see how I created it, feel free to watch this video. All right, guys, let's get started. First things first, let's open up Visual Studio Code in the folder of your choosing. And once it's open, we're going to open up our terminal, and we're going to type in npm init, which starts the project for us. I'm just going to name it API, skip the version, skip the description, make my entry point source/server.ts because we're going to be using TypeScript. Skip all this stuff and just type in yes. And now we have our package.json file. The next thing we're going to do is do an npm install -g, TypeScript, nodemon, ts node, and prettier. Why we're doing the -g is to install these packages globally. That way they're available to us throughout any npm project. The other reason we're doing it globally is because prettier and TypeScript, as well as nodemon, all allow us to run them separately by themselves against certain files. So we're going to install those. Now, once that's done, the next step that we're going to take is we're going to make sure that we have the prettier extension installed inside of our Visual Studio Code. That way, it automatically formats the code for you in some instances if you have it set properly, and to know that it's using prettier. So next, let's do a tsc --init, which sets up our directory for TypeScript. We're going to open up this tsconfig JSON file here, and we're going to uncomment the out directory and make this /build. This is going to be the directory once we compile our TypeScript into normal JavaScript. Next, we're going to change this test function here to just a build function, and we're going to make this command rm-rf our build directory. We're going to type the and to run another command. The command we're going to be running is prettier --write, and it's going to be our source folder. And then we're going to add two more ampersands and type tsc, which allows us to compile the project into JavaScript from TypeScript. The reason that we're putting this here is so when you run npm run build, it automatically gets rid of the old build folder, cleans up the code for you if Visual Studio Code hasn't done that already, and then compiles it into TypeScript. So our next step is going to be npm install, and now we're going to put in some of our packages. We're going to do express, body parser, and .env. The reason we're picking these is for some very specific reasons. Express is going to be the framework that provides us with everything we need to build an API. .env allows us to access environment variables if you choose to do so in whatever server environment you're running your API in. And body parser allows us to easily figure out what kind of data is being sent through our HTTP requests and parses it for us. So we're going to install those. And now the next step is to install our type definitions. What these are is extra packages that sit on top of our packages express.env and body parser that have TypeScript definitions so that the TypeScript compiler and our linting understands what we're trying to do. So we're going to type in npm install --save-dev. We're going to do @types express, @types body parser, and @types .env, and install those. Now, the next thing we're going to do is set up our prettier configuration, and we do that by creating a .prettierrc file in our main directory. Now, I'm just going to copy and paste this from an older project and let you guys look at the documentation for prettier to find out exactly what all these settings mean. But basically what these do is allow us to clean up our code automatically or by running that prettier command in our npm build command. And now that we've done that, we're going to make a folder called .vscode and create a file called settings.json. And I'm also going to copy and paste this in here as well. Again, you can get this from the GitHub repository. What this file is going to allow us to do is to automatically tell Visual Studio Code how to format our project for us and to tell it to automatically pick up the Prettier extension. Now that we're done setting up our configuration, let's go ahead and start programming our API. We're going to go ahead and create a source folder, and inside of it, a config folder. I always like to begin with our logging, so let's create a logging.ts file. And we're going to make our own custom logger and start out with a function called constant get timestamp. That's going to return a type string, and we're going to have it return a new date object .toISO string. What this does is basically gives us the current date in a nice human readable format. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and create a const info function. Inside of this, we are going to be having a namespace that is of type string, a message of type string, and then an object of type any. What the object of type any is for is in case we want to actually pass through an object and take a look at it in its JSON format. Now that we've done that, we're going to go inside and type if object to see if we have an object being passed or not. Then we're going to be doing a logging.info. Actually, I'm sorry, that should be a console. We'll just do console.log for now. And we're going to open it up with the tildes inside of the console.log. Going to put a couple brackets here, and we're going to start to format our message. Let's go ahead and put a reference to the function get timestamp right here. Next, we can put in our info metric so that we know this is an info log. Next, we can put in the namespace. The reason that we're putting a namespace in is so you can quickly determine where this logging function was called, because they're all going to be referencing the logging function from this file. And then finally, we could put our message inside of it. And then at the very end, let's go ahead and put our object. That is, of course, if the object is there, console.log will log it for us at the end. Now we can put our else statement, copy this function over, and just get rid of the object at the end, so that now whenever we call this function, if we don't have an object, it'll just default to the second console log that you see here. So let's copy this function, paste it a couple times. We're going to paste it 3 times, and we're going to create 3 more functions that copy this. We're going to start with our warn function, change the console log to a console warn, change the capital info to a capital warn, and we're going to do the same thing for error and debug. Once we're done creating our functions, we're going to type export default, and we could just do an object here, and we're going to just export each of the functions. So we can just do info, warn, error, and debug. This notation is unique to JavaScript, where you don't actually have to declare a key and then a value if your key and value are the same name. So if I'm just exporting info, it will know to export a function called info. There's one more thing that you're going to notice when you were copy and pasting these logging functions, and that's Prettier and Visual Studio Code working together will automatically format them for you. So whatever you have your Prettier config set to and your settings.json set to, it's going to be shown directly affected here every time you copy and paste or save your file. Next, we're going to create a file inside of our config folder called config.ts. And we're going to start off by importing .env from .env. This is to import environment variables. We're going to call .env.config, which actually loads the environment variables for you. Now we're going to make a const server underscore port, and we're going to have this equal to process.env.server underscore port with a default value of 1337. So if you just pause the video and take a look here for a second, what this is doing is first it's checking to see if process.env.server port exists, and if it doesn't, assign it the default value of 1337. We're going to just copy and paste that and change this one to hostname. We're going to do the same thing for the variable over here and just change the hostname to localhost. The next thing we're going to do is create a constant server object, and inside of it, we're going to define our port and hostname as the constants we defined above. last but not least, we're going to create a constant config object and assign a server key to the server constant we created above. And then we're going to export default config. What this does is basically allow you to access all of the variables we just defined. So when you're inside of another file, you can type in something like config.server.port to get that value. It should be noted that the .env library initially tries to load your environment variables from a .env file. You should take a look at .env's documentation to figure out how exactly you want to configure it for your project. Now we're going to go ahead and create our server.ts file inside of our source folder. This file is going to be the meat of our API, and it's going to link everything together. So we're going to divide this up into sections, starting with the imports. So let's go ahead and import HTTP from HTTP, import Express from Express, import body parser from body parser, import logging from our config.logging file, and import config from our config file. Next, we're going to declare our namespace as constant namespace is equal to server, and we're going to declare our router equaling the express function. Our router is going to be what defines our API's behavior, and our namespace is going to be what we use to determine where our logs are coming from. The next section of our server file that we're going to define is our logging. So what we're going to do is we're going to inject into our router a piece of what's called middleware. And all middleware is going to have the request object, response object, and next function available to it. And what middleware is basically, it's a function that allows you to either modify the request that's being sent in, or to read it, or to do something with the data that's being passed around, and either end it right there and return it to the user, or continue on to another piece of middleware. What we're going to do is we're going to use our logging.info function. We're going to first inject our namespace so that when it logs with the namespace of server. Then we're going to add 2 tildes, and inside of it, we're going to be adding 3 variables, a method, a URL, and an IP. The method can be accessed from the request.method, the URL from request.url, and the IP from request.socket.remote address if it is defined. If it's not defined and you print it here, don't worry, all that's going to show up is an empty space. Once we've created this, let's copy it. Now we're going to access the response through our middleware. So we're going to type in response.on, and we're going to put finish inside of the quotation marks. What we're going to do here is basically say that this is basically a listener for any time that the response is finished, fire off this function. And inside of it, we're just going to copy and paste the logging that we just had and simply add the status code to it by accessing it from the response.statuscode. It should be noted that this response.statuscode is going to be the status that we return depending on the route that the user picks. So after we're done logging, the next thing we want to do is parse the body of the request. So this is where we're going to inject our body parser. So what we're going to do is we're going to type router use, and on the inside we're going to do body parser.url encoded, and in brackets we're going to insert an object with the key extended equal to false. And after that, we're going to do router.use body parser.json as a function. What these 2 injections do is first allows us to send nested JSON to our API. Although we're not doing anything with that in this tutorial, it's going to be something that you're probably going to be using in the future. So it's a good time to set it now. And the body parser.json allows us to basically not have to call json.parse or use json.stringify on the React side. It basically takes care of all of that for you. The next thing we're going to do is define the rules of our API. Rules such as what kind of methods are allowed, such as get, patch, delete, or post, where our requests can come from, and what kind of headers are allowed. So let's open up a new piece of middleware, and we're going to add the following things in here. First, we're going to start with our response.header, and we're going to put inside of it, inside the first quotes, we're going to put access control allow origin with dashes in between, and we're going to go comma, and in the next set of brackets we're just going to put a star. What that means is for now our request can come from anywhere. When you're creating a production API, do not have this. Make sure you have your IPs and routes predefined. The next is going to be our response.header, and in this one similarly we're going to put access control allow headers, and the headers we're going to put in are the following: origin, comma, x dash requested dash with, content dash type, accept, and authorization. Once we're finished with this, the next thing we can do is put a little if statement and put if our request.method is equal to options, return a header that shows us all of the options we're allowed to put, as you see me type here, and then simply type in return response.status 200.json with an empty object. This just returns a response of 200, which means that the method was accepted. And it lets you know what kind of methods you're allowed to use inside of this API. This probably won't get called, as if you're programming it, you're going to know what's going on. That being said, it's always good to have this. So far, the request is going to bounce off our logging. It's going to bounce off the body parser, and then it's going to come through here, all of them acting as pieces of middleware. The next thing that we're going to define is our routes. So we're going to put a little placeholder here for our routes because we actually haven't created them yet. And we're going to move on to error handling. So what that is that if our API gets by all of our defined routes, that means that the user or program has entered a route that doesn't actually exist. So let's go ahead and create a piece of middleware, define a constant error. We're just going to type in new error not found. And then we're going to return a response.status of 404. You can look up the response codes you need to use online. We're going to add a JSON object, and it's going to have a message key with the error message that we defined above. So let's go ahead and define our server now. Now that we have everything else pretty much defined, we're going to create a section for it down here, create the server, and we're going to create an object, and we're going to call it HTTP server. We're going to make this equal to the http.createServer method, and we're going to inject our router into it. Our router contains all our predefined routes and error handling and middleware. And then we're going to call our HTTP server.listen. We're going to pass in our config.server.port that we created in our config file. And then we're going to add a function callback and add a little logging statement saying, hey, you actually turned on your server. So let's put in the namespace. And inside of the tildes, let's go ahead and drop in server running on. Then we can inject our config.server.hostname. We'll put a colon, and then we'll do our config.server.port so it logs the message for us properly. And let's finish that up here. Now, if we go inside our terminal, we can type nodemon source/server_ts. It'll start the server for us. And let's go ahead and open Postmon, or you can use the web browser and try and hit our API and see what happens. Now you'll notice that I sent the request, but nothing's happening. And if you caught on before, if you've worked with NodeJS and Express before, you'll notice that I forgot to actually add the next functions to the middleware that I defined before. So the middleware that involves the logging, and the rules of the API both need the next function, or the request won't get passed through. So let's go ahead and throw those in. Now that these methods are in, let's go back to Postmon and let's try and run this again. And now you'll see that it works. We get our little not found message, which means that the API is currently working properly. So we can go ahead and cancel out of nodemon now. This brings us to our final step. Let's create two new folders inside of our source folder, one called controllers and one called routes. The controllers are going to hold the functions for our API, and the routes are what going to define the literal pathing or routes to get to those functions using the API. So let's create a file inside of our controllers folder called sample.ts. Inside of that file, let's go ahead and import. We're going to put some braces here from Express. And inside of those braces, we're going to want three things. We're going to want the request interface, the response interface, and the next function. That way, when we define our middleware in this file, it will already have the types associated with it. So let's create a const sample health check. And inside, we're going to define the middleware as we did before, but this time we're actually going to have to assign the interfaces to it. So you're going to have to go ahead and put a colon with the appropriate object after each object, as you're seeing here. So in the end, it looks like this, with the request being assigned to the REQ, the response being assigned to the RES, and the next function being assigned to the next variable. Now at the top of the file, let's go ahead and define our namespace for our sample controller, and we can name it just that, sample controller. This is going to be used for the logging. So inside of our function, let's call logging.info. You'll see that it automatically imports because I'm using Visual Studio Code. Let's go ahead and put our namespace variable. Inside of it, let's have a message saying sample health check route called. So the purpose of this route is simply to see if the API is working or not, or just a sample for you guys. On the inside, let's do a return response.status 200 and have a JSON with a message just containing the word pong. Obviously, because when we define our route, the route's going to be called ping. Now that we've created this function, at the end of the file, we need to export it. So let's just export, open up an object, put the sample health check in, and close it off. Now let's go ahead and create our sample route file. So another sample.ts file in the routes folder. Inside of this one, we're going to be importing Express from Express as we did inside of the server file. Here we're going to define our router as express.router as a function. Next, we're going to add a router.get, defining that this is actually a GET request. Give it the path /ping, and we're going to type controller dot. We're going to import the controller from the controller folder. And you'll notice that the controller is underlined. That's because we don't actually have a default export. So let's go back to the file and export it properly. Just put the word default right here. Now we can access it as an object and access the sample health check function. Last but not least, we just need to export the router. How we do that here is just type export equals router. Now that our router is defined, we're going to go back to our server.ts file. We're going to import our sample routes from our routes sample file. And we're going to scroll down to where we put the placeholder before, and we're going to type router.use, give the routes a prefix so we can do something like sample. That way when we call it, it will actually have the /sample before the ping. We're going to add the sample routes variable here, and then we're going to turn on our server. Once the server's on, we're going to go back to NodeMon, add the sample /ping, and we get our message pong. Finally, we can cancel out of NodeMon, and if you want, you can run npm run build. And what you're going to see is the prettier function run and a build folder appear after Typescript compiles our project. So if you take a look inside the build folder, you're going to see that it's all normal JavaScript. That means that you have a build ready to go, ready to deploy somewhere. All right, guys, that's it. Thanks so much for tuning back in. I hope you enjoyed the video and have fun in the repository. Take it easy, guys.